I'm Sonia Jorge. I'm one of two executive directors of the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership, and my colleague Anika Makwakwa and I co-lead the organization. And we're very proud to be able to say that we lead GDIP, as we call ourselves, as a feminist organization that not only organizes as a coalition to bring public, private, and civil society organizations together to focus on meaningful connectivity for the global majority, but we also do that in a way that we feel is really representative and a reflection of our principles and philosophy as feminist leaders. The research that ISOC Foundation supported at GDIP was really for us to look at two key questions. One, understanding the costs of exclusion and what it means for digital societies to really not include women and girls in the makeup of a digital society. And when they don't take active action to change that, what is society losing, right? So putting really a dollar sign to it, because really policymakers and politicians pay attention to numbers. And so it's one way of really calling attention to these kinds of questions. So one was to understand what are those costs, right, of that exclusion and really a reflection of these inequalities, inequities in society. But the second piece of the research question was understanding the gendered impacts of meaningful connectivity, especially through the global pandemic. So trying to understand how women and girls, and really women in all of their diversity, have interacted with technology through the pandemic, how they dealt with the exclusion and the challenges that they were facing, and to what extent those that had meaningful connectivity and those that did not have, how did they deal with those challenges? How did that change their digital experience, their use, their ability to benefit from digital connectivity, their ability to engage with technology, and also really leverage the opportunity as citizens, as digital citizens in a society, their opportunity to exercise their rights, to exercise their voice, to be able to make choices in terms of business, economic decisions as family folks, but also as thinkers, as creators, as innovators. So really understanding how the possibilities of meaningful connectivity really not only can change, but to what extent are women able to embrace that change when given the possibility. It means that in addition to just being able to have internet once in a while, which is this kind of very basic understanding of internet use, it's a much more comprehensive and holistic understanding of connectivity that starts from a basic understanding of affordability. So being able to afford what one needs to have, the need to have the technological kind of basic threshold for meaningful connectivity is a certain level of data, speed, frequent daily use, and an appropriate device. So the ability of people to have a device that is at a minimum of smartphone that functions on equivalent to a 4G network with sufficient data, and the frequency that people want to use the internet, being at home, at school, at work, what have you. But in addition to that is having the ability to make that use productive and useful in people's livelihoods, right? So understanding, do people have the right skills to actually engage with that connectivity when they have affordable, meaningful connectivity? Do they also have the skills? Are they able to exercise their rights online once they have the ability to connect? And is the environment where they live one that is conducive to opportunities, or is in fact one that is restrictive? Because we as digital citizens live in a context. And the context is not just one of machines and devices, is one of culture, society, economies that not only provide opportunities, but at the same time restrict, limit, or create conditions. And for women, that's especially important. And so by looking at meaningful connectivity from a gendered perspective, it's also our way to understand how is that experience different for women and girls and marginalized population groups, and what is it that we need to do from a policy perspective to make sure that those challenges and barriers that hinder productive, useful, healthy engagement are not taken away from people, right? Because it is people's rights to have access to information and connectivity. Basically, think about here you are a man interviewing me, I'm a woman. And what happens in many parts of the world is by the sheer fact of you being a man and me being a woman, because of, say, income differences, I, as a woman, would not be able to have the same kind of device that you have, or the same kind of connectivity, because, if at all, right? Because by default, women in many societies make about 30 to 40% less than men, which reduces their ability to be able to pay, to purchase, right, data services, devices, and also exercising their rights as human beings, right? And so the gender digital divide is one way of understanding, first, how is technology and access to digital technology different between the genders? And when there is a difference, where is that difference coming from? So that we can then attack that difference, right? And try to solve it and resolve for it. If we don't understand what the gaps are, so it's a good question to ask, what is it and where is it coming from? If we don't understand, we cannot resolve the problem. So first is understanding and recognizing that, in fact, because of socioeconomic and cultural issues, there is a difference between women's and men's access. And even when women have access, they experience that access in different ways. So I like to give an example to be more clear on this question. So meaningful connectivity, too, as a concept, is one that we developed to make sure that we understand connectivity from a quality perspective and reliability and the exercise of rights. And so a country like Colombia, for example, that people tend to say, oh, all women in Colombia have exactly the same level of access as men to the internet. And that may appear that is true when you look at internet access kind of in these very basic and generalized terms. But the truth is, women in Colombia and men have very different experiences. And there is actually a meaningful connectivity gender gap that is close to 20%. Why? Because Colombian women are not able to buy as many data plans and the level of data plans that men can. And on average, they have lower capacity devices. And so if you start measuring and understanding connectivity and the meaningfulness and the usefulness of connectivity from the perspective of gender, you also understand that we are, by default, creating these inequities in the experience and the usability of technology, right? Because we are accepting these inequalities in society and economies. And we can't accept that, right? The equality has to exist across the board at all levels, at all dimensions of our existence. And so meaningful connectivity is one way of adding all these multidimensional pieces of who we are as humans and making sure that when we work with policymakers, we address humans, their public, their citizens, in their totality and not in parts, or if they were subpar humans. No one is a subpar human, right? Everybody deserves to have the same exact kind of access, regardless of their gender, their race, their geography, their income. And society has the responsibility to solve for those issues. So for low and middle income countries, the global majority countries that we cover in our research, that cost is well over $1 trillion in the past decade. But what's most interesting to me is that we also calculate the cost for just the next 5 years. And why the next 5 years, right? There's a reason for it, because the Sustainable Development Goals are tagged up to 2030, right? So when you look at the next 5 years of us as a society looking at the SDGs, we have these commitments that we are way far behind, even coming close to achieving. But in terms of meaningful connectivity, if we don't do anything about the gender digital divide and the current reality of that gender digital divide, we will lose about 500 billion in just low and middle income countries if we don't do anything to bring more women and girls and marginalized populations to the online world. So it's not just about wanting to do good. This is not just about altruism and public interest. It's beyond that. It's about humanity, right? It's about ensuring that everyone has access to, a good enough and the same level of experience. And if we don't do that, we actually compromising all of us, because as I always like to say, when people ask me, I am a poorer person and I'm a less interesting person if I cannot connect to my peers and women that I want to learn with from India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Pakistan, or Argentina. If I cannot connect with them and learn, right, from their experiences, I am not a good enough person in the world. I'm a more limited person, right? So we also economically, socially, but also culturally and on a personal level are less than what we could be without the experiences that others can bring to our existence. Absolutely, we have several recommendations. And also the other thing that we have in our report, in addition to very specific 4 levels of recommendations, is that we also illustrate what they look like in practice. So for each set of recommendations that we have in our report, that I invite you to look at, we actually show how in different parts of the world, these kinds of things are already taking place, so that policymakers and organizations that work with policymakers from civil society to private sector and other parts of the public machinery, right, of governance, that they understand how their peers have participated in these good illustrations, these demonstrations of how things can be better. So we have many different examples from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, of where policymakers really, as a result of the work of civil society, private sector, research institutions, have decided and taken action that was not only more interesting, but more impactful in terms of their universal service funds, in terms of their overall digital policy, policies on digital skills and literacy, including with ministries of education, as well as recommendations and policy around investing in infrastructure, the type of infrastructure, where should the infrastructure be. So 4 levels of recommendation. I urge you to look at that. Too much to go into now, but very specific and lots of examples of what they look like in practice. Absolutely. Private sector is a key player, and we have to work with private sector. And if we didn't, we would do a disservice, right, to all of us. So private sector has a role to play to also make sure that their products, their services, their strategic thinking is really done from a gender perspective, and it ensures that everyone is benefiting from what they supply, right? What they produce, what they sell. If they are not thinking about their services and products as attractive to everyone or affordable to everyone, they are not doing their part. So they need to also think about the fact that their consumers, right, their users, are a multitude of people that have different abilities, different economic circumstances, and social circumstances. And so they also have a role to play to educate themselves and make sure that they create the conditions so that many more people can actually come to their own services, products, platforms, what have you. So they have an important role to play, and they also have a role to play as partners in institutions and organizations in their countries, in their regions where they function, so that they become an active player in these, what I like to call a collective effort to really improve the circumstances of digital development in societies. We can't expect the world to become so dependent on digitalization, including governments expecting their own citizens to have to depend on digital services for registering a child, signing up for schools or attending what have you, or being civic participants in society, and not providing the opportunity for people to actually be engaged in a digital space. So it's really a collective responsibility. And right now, it's not just urgent, it's an imperative, I would say. If we are not part of that solution, as private, civil society, public, academia, what have you, regardless of the role you play in society, we're doing a disservice. Well, tremendously, because one of the things that it's really important about these research, especially when you do gender-based research and gender analysis, is that you have to use survey research. And when we say survey, it's both quantitative survey research, but also, and just as important, which is something that for us is really, really critical, and we really appreciate the support of the foundation on that, is qualitative research. You cannot understand the nuances of gender and marginalization unless you do qualitative and really ethnographic research, because data and surveys can only go so far, right? You can have an idea, but you're not going to know how gender relations and gender power relations especially work at the household level or even at the community level unless you observe that, right? Data doesn't really tell you too much about it. There's just too much nuance. So being able to bring together very solid, robust quantitative research with qualitative research and ethnographic research is absolutely instrumental. And so that was one thing that for us was very important with this particular grant and support, and really the trust. But the other thing is that as an organization, we're fortunate to be in a situation that we have a reputation for our research. Our team, as a team that is very well experienced, we are known in our space, and we are fortunate that our partners not only trust what we do, but understand that when we advocate and make recommendations, they are based on evidence. They know that if myself or my colleagues are speaking at an event, or if I'm talking to you and I say, I believe we should do X, Y, and Z, I don't just say that because I think it's a good idea. It is actually based on the research and what the evidence is showing. And so because we also have worked very hard to build that reputation and credibility in our sector, we can speak to policymakers and different kinds of decision makers with not just the authority, but the credibility that really is important and helps decision makers to say, okay, we trust GDIP, we trust what they are saying, and so we are going to follow through.